Hello everyone.
About 70% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be very happy if you did.
I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Story 1. The Stalker. It started as a vague sense of unease, the kind that makes you check over your shoulder without quite knowing why. I worked late shifts, coming home in the deep hours of the night, the streets deserted except for the occasional flicker of a distant street lamp. At first I thought it was just the darkness playing tricks on my mind, but then I noticed the shadows lingering in corners a little too long, the distant sound of footsteps that never quite caught up to me. One night, as I parked my car, I saw something fluttering beneath my windshield wiper. It was a folded piece of paper, damp from the light drizzle that had begun to fall. I pulled it out, expecting a parking ticket or a flyer. Instead, it was a handwritten note, the ink smeared but still legible. The words sent a chill down my spine. It was a simple message, just a few lines, but it contained personal details about my life, things that only someone who had been watching me would know. I see you every night at Red. You work late, and you always wear that green jacket. You should be more careful. My heart raced as I looked around, trying to spot anyone lurking in the shadows. But the street was empty, silent except for the distant hum of the city. I got into my car and drove home, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I felt like a hunted animal, my every move watched by unseen eyes. At home, I locked the doors and windows, drawing the curtains tight. I double-checked the locks and even propped a chair under the doorknob, just in case. Sleep was impossible. Every creak and groan of the old building sent my imagination into overdrive. Was someone outside, watching, waiting for me to let my guard down? The next day, I told my friends about the note, but they brushed it off. It's probably just some prank, they said. Don't let it get to you, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something more sinister. I started taking different routes to work, changing my routines, but no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the feeling of being followed. A week later, another note appeared. This time, it was inside my mailbox. The message was more direct, more threatening. You think you can hide from me? I've been watching you for a long time. I know where you live. My heart sank as I read the words. Whoever was doing this knew not just my work schedule, but also my home address. I felt violated, exposed. I called the police, but they were dismissive. We can't do much without more evidence, they said. Keep an eye out, and let us know if anything else happens. I felt helpless, like a puppet on strings, manipulated by an unseen hand. The notes kept coming, each one more menacing than the last. I started seeing signs of someone tampering with my car, the hood left slightly ajar, or the gas cap unscrewed. It felt like a game to whoever was doing this, a cruel cat and mouse game where I was always the prey. One night, I came home to find my front door unlocked. I had locked it that morning, I was sure of it. Inside, nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of violation was overwhelming. Someone had been inside my home, walking through my private space. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend. The next day, I decided to move. It was the only way I could think of to escape this nightmare. I left no forwarding address, no trace of my new location. I hoped that by disappearing, I could finally find peace. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that someone is out there, still playing the game. I keep my head down, avoid eye contact with strangers, and live in constant fear that the next note will find me, no matter where I go. The stalker is out there, and I know he'll never stop watching. The abandoned house. We'd been talking about it for weeks, the abandoned house on the edge of town. It stood there like a haunted sentinel, its windows boarded up and ivy creeping up its crumbling walls. Everyone in town knew the stories about it. how it had been empty for decades, how people said it was haunted by the ghosts of its former occupants. But we were teenagers, and that meant we were fearless, or at least we pretended to be. One summer night, my friends and I decided it was time to explore the house. We were 5 in total: me, Marcus, Lisa, Jamie, and Ben. Marcus was the ringleader, always full of bravado and daring ideas. Lisa and Jamie were the cautious ones, but they didn't want to be left out. Ben was the quiet one, always tagging along but rarely saying much. And I was somewhere in between, curious but wary. We snuck out of our homes after midnight and met at the edge of town, flashlights in hand. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the fields. We made our way through the overgrown weeds, our footsteps muffled by the thick grass. As we got closer to the house, the air grew colder, and a strange silence fell over us. The usual sounds of crickets and night birds were absent, replaced by an almost oppressive stillness. The front door was boarded up, but Marcus had brought a crowbar. He pried off the boards, and the door creaked open with a groan. The air inside was musty, filled with the scent of decay and mildew. Our flashlights illuminated the dusty floor and broken furniture. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and rats scurried across the floor as we stepped inside. We moved cautiously through the rooms, our footsteps echoing in the empty space. The wallpaper was peeling, and the floorboards creaked with every step. There was a sense of foreboding, as if the house itself was warning us to turn back. But Marcus pressed on, and we followed, our curiosity getting the better of us. As we explored the first floor, we found nothing unusual, just the remnants of a once grand house that had fallen into disrepair. But when we reached the basement, everything changed. The wooden stairs creaked under our weight, and the air grew colder as we descended. The smell of damp earth filled the air, and our flashlights revealed a scene that sent chills down our spines. The basement was a mess. Broken furniture lay in heaps, and the walls were stained with dark streaks that looked like blood. There were old, discarded tools scattered about, and in the corner, a large tarp covered a lumpy shape. We approached cautiously, our flashlights trembling in our hands. Marcus pulled back the tarp, and we all gasped in horror. Beneath the tarp was a shallow pit, filled with dirt and debris. It looked like a grave. The bloodstains on the walls, the broken furniture, it all made sense now. This wasn't just an abandoned house, it was the site of something terrible, something violent. We stood there in stunned silence, the realization sinking in. "Guys, we need to get out of here," Jamie said, his voice trembling. But before we could move, we heard a noise from upstairs, a heavy thud, like something falling. We froze, our hearts racing. There shouldn't have been anyone else in the house, but the sound was unmistakable. "Let's go," I said, my voice barely a whisper. We scrambled up the stairs, our flashlights bobbing in the darkness. The thuds grew louder, closer, as if someone or something was coming down the hall. We didn't wait to find out who it was. We ran, stumbling over the broken floorboards and dodging debris. The front door was just ahead, and we burst through it, out into the night. We didn't stop running until we were back in town, gasping for breath and drenched in sweat. We didn't talk about what we saw in that basement, not with anyone else. But the images stayed with us, the blood-stained walls, the shallow grave, and the sense that we had stumbled upon something we were never meant to see. The abandoned house still stands on the edge of town, its secrets hidden within its crumbling walls. I haven't been back since that night, and I don't plan to. The stories were right, there's something in that house, something dark and dangerous. And it's better left undisturbed. The Hitchhiker. It was one of those nights when the road seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness, the only light coming from my car's headlights. I was driving home after a long day, my mind drifting between fatigue and the familiar comfort of my favorite songs playing softly on the radio. The highway was deserted, with only the occasional flicker of distant taillights breaking the monotony. I almost didn't notice the hitchhiker at first. He was standing on the side of the road, a small backpack slung over one shoulder, his thumb extended in the universal gesture for a ride. Normally I wouldn't have stopped, but there was something about him that seemed harmless. Maybe it was the way he stood, slightly hunched, or the way he waved as I approached. He didn't look like a threat, just a tired traveler in need of a lift. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Where you heading?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Just a few miles down the road," he replied. His voice was friendly, his smile disarming. "I'm meeting some friends at a rest stop. I'd appreciate the ride." I hesitated for a moment, then unlocked the passenger door. He climbed in and we set off down the highway. At first it was fine. He seemed like a decent guy, making small talk about the weather, the traffic, and his travel plans. I was glad for the company, and I thought nothing of it when he started asking me questions. "So you live around here?" he asked, glancing at me with those curious eyes. "Yeah, not far," I replied, keeping my focus on the road. "Got any family in town?" he asked. "Just some friends," I said, feeling a slight twinge of discomfort. "What about you?" "Been traveling for a while," he said, looking out the window. "Trying to see the country, you know. It's good to meet new people." The conversation continued like that for a while, casual and friendly. But then his questions started getting more personal, like he was probing for information. He asked about my job, my routines, my plans for the weekend. I brushed it off, trying to steer the conversation back to neutral topics. But he kept pushing, his tone getting just a little too curious. "Do you live alone?" he asked, and that's when my instinct screamed that something was wrong. I shot him a quick glance, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Why do you want to know?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "Oh, just curious," he replied with that same smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm always interested in how people live their lives." The mood in the car shifted, the air growing tense and heavy. I knew I needed to get rid of him, but we were in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. I couldn't just stop and let him out, it felt too risky. I had to think fast, come up with a plan to get him out of my car without raising suspicion. "So what about this rest stop?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Is it coming up soon?" "Yeah, just a few more miles," he said, his gaze fixed on me. "It's a nice spot. You should check it out." I nodded, pretending to be interested, but my mind was racing. I had to get him out of the car, and I had to do it without making him suspicious. I slowed down as we approached the next exit, hoping to find a place to drop him off. "Hey, there's a gas station coming up," I said, pointing to the sign. "You want to stop there and grab a drink?" He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure, sounds good," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. I pulled into the gas station, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to stay calm, act normal, and find a way to get him out of my car without drawing attention. I parked near the entrance, turned off the engine, and turned to him with a forced smile. "Well, this is where I stop," I said, hoping my voice didn't betray my nerves. "Good luck with your trip." He seemed to hesitate, as if he was deciding whether to push his luck or not. But then he nodded and grabbed his backpack. "Thanks for the ride," he said, stepping out of the car. "Maybe I'll see you around." I didn't wait to see if he was serious or not. As soon as he was out of the car, I drove off, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The road ahead was empty, but the darkness felt oppressive, like it was closing in on me. I knew I'd made the right choice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something terrible. I kept driving, not stopping until I was safely back in my own neighborhood. From then on, I never picked up another hitchhiker. It just wasn't worth the risk. The wrong delivery. It was just another ordinary day, or so I thought. I had just gotten home from work, ready to settle into my usual evening routine. As I walked up to my front door, I noticed a package sitting on the doorstep. It was a plain brown box, nothing out of the ordinary, except that it wasn't addressed to me. There was no name, just my address, but I didn't recognize the sender's name on the label. The return address was blacked out, completely unreadable. The curiosity got the better of me. I thought it might be something intended for a neighbor, but there were no other markings on the package to give me a clue. Maybe it was a mix-up from the delivery service, I reasoned. Still, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. I brought the package inside, deciding to open it and see if there were any clues about who it belonged to. I sat down at my kitchen table and carefully peeled back the tape. Inside was a stack of photographs, wrapped in plastic. I took them out, expecting to find snapshots of a family vacation or something equally benign. But as I flipped through the photos, my heart sank, and a cold chill ran down my spine. The photographs were of people, men and women, all tied up and gagged, their expressions a mixture of fear and helplessness. Some of them had bruises on their faces and arms, as if they had been beaten. The backgrounds in the photos varied, but they all seemed to be taken in dimly lit rooms, with shadows looming in the corners. There was no explanation, no context, just these horrifying images. I felt a surge of panic. Who would send something like this? Was it a sick prank, or something more sinister? I had no idea what to do with the photos. I couldn't just throw them away, that seemed wrong, as if I was ignoring something terrible. But I also couldn't keep them in my house, knowing what they depicted. My first instinct was to call the police, but then I hesitated. What if this was some kind of setup? What if the sender knew I would open the package and then called the authorities? Would I become a target if I got involved? My mind raced with all the worst-case scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. I decided to take a different approach. I grabbed a pair of gloves from under the sink, not wanting to leave any fingerprints on the photographs, and carefully placed them back in the box. I then sealed the package with new tape and wrote a note on the front: wrong delivery. Please return to sender. I left it on my doorstep, hoping that whoever delivered it would take it back, and that would be the end of it. The next day, the package was gone. I felt a brief sense of relief, thinking that maybe it had all been a mistake, a simple mix-up that was now resolved. But that feeling didn't last long. As I was driving to work, I noticed a car following me. It was a nondescript sedan, dark gray, with tinted windows. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I realized it had been behind me for several miles, never getting too close but always keeping me in its sights. My anxiety grew as I drove. Was it related to the package? Was someone watching me, waiting to see what I would do with the photographs? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. At work, I couldn't focus. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the gray sedan parked in the lot. It wasn't, but the fear lingered, gnawing at my nerves. I decided to leave early, hoping to avoid whoever might be watching me. On my way home, I took a different route, weaving through side streets and taking random turns to throw off anyone following me. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The paranoia grew with each passing hour, until I couldn't take it anymore. I drove straight to the police station, package or no package. I knew I had to report what I saw, even if it meant drawing unwanted attention. When I walked through those doors, I felt a strange mix of fear and relief, like I was stepping into the light after being trapped in the darkness. I told the officer everything: the package, the photographs, the car following me. He listened carefully, jotting down notes, and then asked me to wait while he spoke to his superior. I sat in the waiting area, my heart racing, my hands sweating. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure: I would never open a package that wasn't addressed to me again. Not after what I saw inside that box. The missing camper. We'd been planning the camping trip for weeks. It was supposed to be a break from our hectic lives, a chance to disconnect from the world and enjoy the serenity of the wilderness. Our group consisted of 5 of us: me, Sam, Jess, Mike, and Greg. We drove deep into the forest, far from the usual trails, where the trees grew thick and the air was fresh with the scent of pine. The first night was perfect. We set up our tents around a roaring campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. We laughed and joked, enjoying each other's company and the simple pleasure of being in nature. It was the second night when things started to go wrong. Greg had volunteered to gather firewood, so he wandered off into the woods, his flashlight casting eerie beams through the trees. We didn't think much of it at first. He was a seasoned camper and knew his way around the forest. But as the minutes turned into an hour, and then 2, we began to worry. "Where's Greg?" Jess asked, her voice tinged with concern. "He probably got lost," Mike said, trying to sound reassuring. "Let's give him a little more time." But as the night grew darker and the fire began to die down, we knew something was wrong. We grabbed our flashlights and started calling out for him, our voices echoing through the trees. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of shadows and rustling leaves. We searched for hours, our anxiety growing with each passing minute. Finally, we stumbled upon Greg's campsite. It was a mess. His tent was torn to shreds, his gear scattered across the ground. The campfire had been extinguished, and there were deep claw marks gouged into the dirt and tree trunks. It was like something had torn through the site with savage force, leaving destruction in its wake. But there were no signs of Greg, no footprints leading away, nothing that could give us a clue as to what happened. "Maybe a bear got him," Sam said, his voice shaking, "or a mountain lion." "But there's no blood," I pointed out, "and no other tracks." The lack of any animal signs was disturbing. If it had been a bear or some other predator, there would have been more evidence: fur, scat, or at least some sign of a struggle. But the site was eerily clean, except for the claw marks. It was as if something had taken Greg and vanished without a trace. We continued searching through the night, but there was no sign of him. The forest felt different now, the darkness deeper, the shadows more menacing. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made us jump. The sense of safety we felt on the first night had vanished, replaced by a creeping dread. As dawn approached, we knew we had to get help. We made our way back to our campsite, our spirits heavy with fear and uncertainty. We packed up our gear and headed back to the trailhead, where we could find a signal and call for assistance. It took hours for the authorities to arrive, and even longer for them to organize a proper search. The search team scoured the forest for days, but they found nothing. No signs of Greg, no clues to what happened. The authorities were baffled, unable to explain the destruction at the campsite or the claw marks that marred the trees. They considered it a missing persons case, but to us it was something far stranger. We left the forest without Greg, our hearts heavy with guilt and sorrow. The trip that was supposed to be a joyous escape had turned into a nightmare, one that haunted us for years. We never spoke about the claw marks or the eerie silence in the forest, but we knew something unnatural had taken our friend. To this day, I avoid the woods. The sound of rustling leaves and the sight of claw marks on trees send a shiver down my spine. I don't know what took Greg, but I know it wasn't anything natural, and I never want to go back to that forest again. The missing camper remains a mystery, one that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. The creepy neighbor. Why? Moving into a new apartment is always a bit unsettling, especially when you're alone in a new city. I was excited about the change, though my new place was small but cozy, with a view of the park and a great coffee shop just around the corner. The building was older, but the tenants seemed friendly enough. My neighbor across the hall, Mr. Harris, was particularly welcoming. He was an older man, in his late 60s, with a kindly smile and a voice that always seemed to be on the edge of a chuckle. At first, I didn't think much of his friendliness. He'd nod when we passed in the hallway, occasionally stop to chat about the weather or the latest neighborhood news. It felt like the usual small talk neighbors made, and I was happy to have a friendly face nearby. But then I started to notice things that made me uncomfortable. It began with the way he seemed to be around whenever I left my apartment. I'd open the door to go to work, and there he'd be, checking his mail or pretending to fiddle with his keys. He always had a comment about my outfit or a question about where I was heading. I brushed it off as just neighborly curiosity, but it started to feel like he was watching me a little too closely. The first time I saw him through his window, it was late at night. I was in my living room, reading a book, when I glanced out the window and saw his silhouette in his apartment across the courtyard. He was just standing there, his curtains slightly open, staring into my living room. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe he was just passing by his window. But it kept happening. I'd be in my kitchen, washing dishes, and I'd look up to see him watching me from his window. Sometimes, he'd even give a little wave and smile, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. I started keeping my curtains closed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was always there, just beyond the glass, peering into my life. Then the gifts started showing up. They were small things at first: an apple pie on my doorstep, a bouquet of flowers, a box of chocolates. There was never a note or any explanation, but I knew they were from him. He'd mention them in passing, asking if I'd enjoyed the pie or if the flowers had brightened my day. I didn't like it, but I didn't want to be rude, so I thanked him and hoped he'd get the hint to back off. But the gifts kept coming, and they became more personal. One day I found a book on my doorstep, a rare edition of my favorite novel. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone in the building, but there it was, wrapped in paper with a ribbon. It was unsettling. How could he have known? I was starting to feel trapped, like my privacy was slowly slipping away. I tried confronting him about it, asking him to stop with the gifts, but he just laughed it off, saying he was being neighborly. He had this way of turning everything into a joke, making me feel like I was overreacting. But I knew I wasn't. His behavior was crossing a line, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The breaking point came one night when I heard a noise at my door. It was late, well past midnight, and I was in bed. The sound was soft, like someone was fiddling with the doorknob. My heart raced as I tiptoed to the door and peered through the peephole. There was no one there, but when I opened the door, I found a small box on the welcome mat. Inside was a key, an old, tarnished key with a note that read, "For when you need me." That was it. I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. I packed my bags and left that night, not caring about the lease or the security deposit. I called a friend and crashed on their couch, grateful to be away from that building, away from Mr. Harris and his unsettling gifts. I never went back to that apartment. I told the landlord about what happened, and he assured me that he'd handle it, but I didn't want to take any chances. The whole experience left me feeling violated, like I'd been living under a microscope without even realizing it. I learned a valuable lesson about trusting my instincts and not ignoring red flags, no matter how friendly someone might seem. I just hope Mr. Harris found someone else to fixate on, someone who didn't mind the constant watching and the unwanted gifts. Because I couldn't live like that, not with someone like him lurking just across the hall. The silent call. It was just after midnight when my phone rang, the sudden noise shattering the quiet of my apartment. I was half asleep, bleary-eyed as I fumbled to answer it. But when I said hello, there was nothing but silence on the other end. No background noise, no breathing, just an eerie stillness. I hung up, figuring it was a wrong number or some sort of telemarketing glitch. The next night, the same thing happened. This time, I was more awake, more aware of the unnerving silence. I waited for a voice, for anything that would indicate it wasn't just a dead line, but there was nothing. I asked who it was, but the quiet stretched on, like a void on the other end of the call. The calls kept coming. Every night at the same time, 12:17 EA. It became a twisted routine. I'd be in bed, barely drifting off to sleep, and the phone would ring. I'd answer, hoping for a voice, a clue, anything that would give me some indication of who was behind this. But it was always the same complete, unsettling silence. I started to dread the nights, my anxiety building with each ring. I checked my phone for blocked numbers for anything that might explain the calls, but there was nothing. It was like someone was toying with me, testing my patience or worse, watching to see how I'd react. After a week, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to trace the number, to see where it led. It was an unlisted number, but I had a friend who worked in telecommunications, and he owed me a favor. I called him, explaining what had been happening, and he agreed to help. It took a few days, but he finally got back to me with an address. When he told me where it was, my blood ran cold. The address was right next door to my workplace. It was a small office building, mostly empty after hours, with a few businesses that operated during the day. I couldn't believe it. Someone was calling me from a building I'd been passing every day, just a few steps away from where I worked. The thought sent shivers down my spine. Who could it be, and why were they calling me at such a strange hour? I decided to investigate, but I knew I had to be careful. I didn't want to confront the caller directly. That felt too risky. Instead, I went to work early one morning and parked a block away from the office building. I watched from a distance, hoping to see something unusual, some clue as to who might be behind the calls. The building seemed normal enough during the day, with employees coming and going, delivery trucks pulling up to the loading dock. But as the day wore on and the office workers left, the building grew eerily quiet. By the time night fell, it was completely empty, save for a few dim lights in the hallways. I waited until it was nearly midnight, my heart racing as I checked my watch. I was parked just outside the building, my eyes fixed on the entrance. At exactly 12:17 a.m., my phone rang. I answered, expecting the usual silence, but this time I heard something, a faint rustling, like someone shifting in their seat. I held my breath, listening intently, but then the line went dead. I knew I couldn't keep doing this, couldn't live with the constant fear and uncertainty. The calls were driving me mad, and I needed answers. I got out of my car and approached the building, my footsteps echoing in the empty street. The entrance was locked, but I had a spare key for my workplace, and I knew the building's security system had a blind spot around the back. I crept inside, my senses on high alert. The hallways were empty, the air heavy with anticipation. I made my way to the floor where the calls had been traced, my footsteps barely audible on the worn carpet. The office door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light leaking into the hallway. I pushed it open, my heart pounding in my chest. The office was empty, but a single desk lamp was on, casting a dim glow over the room. There was a phone on the desk, its cord dangling off the edge, and a small tape recorder beside it. The recorder was still running, the tape spinning slowly. I played it back, my hands trembling, and heard my own voice on the other end, asking who was there, pleading for a response. But there was nothing, just the same eerie silence. The calls had been coming from an empty office, from a phone that had been left off the hook. It didn't make sense who would set this up and why. I turned to leave, my mind racing with questions, but as I reached the door, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a note taped to the back of the door, written in a messy scrawl. "See you tomorrow night," it said. I didn't stay to find out what that meant. I fled the building, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I knew I couldn't go back to work, couldn't risk being that close to whoever was behind this. I left the city the next day, abandoning my job and my apartment. It was the only way I could escape the silent calls and the unnerving message left for me. I never found out who was behind it or why they chose me, and I never went back to that office building. But every night, just after midnight, I find myself glancing at my phone, dreading the possibility that it might start ringing again. The strange tenant. As a landlord, you get used to a certain rhythm. People come and go, leases are signed, and rent is collected. It's usually a straightforward business, dealing with minor repairs and tenant complaints. But every now and then you come across someone who gives you that uneasy feeling, the kind that makes you double-check the locks at night. That's how I felt about Mr. Timmons. He was one of my longest-standing tenants, always paid his rent on time, never caused a fuss. But there was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. He never left his apartment during the day, and I rarely saw him interact with anyone else in the building. The other tenants didn't seem to know him either. He was a ghost, a shadow that moved through the halls at odd hours. At first I thought he was just a reclusive sort. Not everyone enjoys socializing, and I respected his privacy. But then I started hearing strange sounds coming from his apartment late at night. It wasn't just music or a television turned up too loud. It was more like muffled voices, as if there was a gathering of people behind his door. But every time I passed by, the noise would stop, and the lights would be off. One night I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a scream, a short, sharp scream, like someone in pain or fear. I rushed to his door, banging on it with my fist, but there was no answer. I called out, asking if everything was okay, but there was only silence. I had a spare key, but I hesitated. What if it was just my imagination, or some weird movie he was watching? I didn't want to overreact. The next day I saw Mr. Timmons in the hallway, as if nothing had happened. He greeted me with his usual nod and that strange, empty smile. I asked if everything was all right, mentioning the noise I heard the night before, but he brushed it off. "Must have been the TV," he said, his voice calm and collected. "Sorry if it disturbed you." I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't prove it. The other tenants began to notice the same things, the strange noises, the odd hours, the way Mr. Timmons seemed to disappear for days at a time, only to reappear without explanation. People started to avoid him, whispering about the creepy tenant on the third floor. One day I received a call from one of the other tenants. They complained about a foul smell coming from Mr. Timmons' apartment, like something was rotting inside. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to investigate. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. I called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried again the next day, but still no response. I decided to enter the apartment, using my spare key. As I stepped inside, the smell hit me, a putrid stench that made me gag. The apartment was dark, the curtains drawn tight. I fumbled for the light switch, my hands trembling, and when I turned on the lights, I saw the source of the smell. A pile of trash had accumulated in the corner, old food containers and rotting garbage. It was disgusting, but it wasn't what caught my attention. What stopped me in my tracks was the wall, an entire wall covered in photographs. They were photos of the other tenants, taken without their knowledge from various angles. Each photo had a face crossed out with a thick black marker. I felt a chill run down my spine as I examined the photos. Some of them were recent, taken just days before, while others were from months ago. It was like Mr. Timmons had been watching everyone in the building, keeping tabs on us, marking us off for some unknown reason. I didn't stay to find out more. I called the police and reported what I'd found, my heart racing with fear and anger. When the officers arrived, they searched the apartment but found no sign of Mr. Timmons. He had vanished, leaving behind his wall of photographs and the smell of decay. The authorities launched an investigation, but they never found him. The photos were taken as evidence, and the other tenants were warned to be cautious. The whole building was on edge, and I knew I couldn't keep renting out that apartment. It was tainted by the memory of Mr. Timmons and his sinister wall. I sold the building a few months later, moving to a new city to escape the haunting memories. But I could never escape the feeling that he was out there somewhere, watching from the shadows. The thought of those photos, with the faces crossed out, still sends shivers down my spine. I learned a valuable lesson as a landlord sometimes. The most seemingly innocent tenants can be the most dangerous. The wrong turn. I was on my way to a friend's house, driving through the back roads of a rural area I wasn't familiar with. It was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the fields and forests. My GPS had lost its signal, leaving me to navigate using road signs and intuition. I thought I was on the right path, but then I missed a turn and found myself on a narrow, dirt road, heading deeper into the woods. I knew I had taken a wrong turn, but I figured I could just turn around and find my way back to the main road. But the farther I went, the more desolate the landscape became. The trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the setting sun. The road was rough, full of potholes and uneven terrain. It felt like I was driving into the middle of nowhere. As I rounded a bend, I saw a run-down house at the end of the road. It was old and dilapidated, with peeling paint and broken windows. An overgrown yard surrounded it, filled with discarded machinery and rusted car parts. A group of men stood outside, leaning against an old truck, their eyes fixed on my car as I approached. I slowed down, realizing I needed to turn around and get out of there. But as I did, one of the men stepped forward, waving his hand as if to get my attention. He had a scruffy beard and a hard expression, his eyes narrowing as he walked toward me. The other men followed, spreading out to surround my car. My heart raced as I realized this wasn't just a simple wrong turn. I'd stumbled into something dangerous. I rolled down my window, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, I'm just lost," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm looking for the main road. Can you point me in the right direction?" The bearded man leaned in, his eyes cold and untrusting. "You took a wrong turn," he said, his voice low and gruff. "This ain't a place for visitors. You best turn around and get out of here." I nodded, trying to act calm. "Thanks for the directions," I said, slowly rolling up my window. But as I reached for the gear shift to back up, one of the other men slammed his hand on the hood of my car, a heavy thud that made me jump in my seat. "Not so fast," he said, a sinister smile spreading across his face. "You look like you could use a drink. Why don't you come inside for a bit?" I shook my head, my pulse racing. "No thanks. I really need to get going," I replied, trying to sound casual. But the men weren't backing down. They moved closer, their expressions turning hostile. I realized they had no intention of letting me leave peacefully. I knew I had to act fast. I put the car in reverse and hit the gas, my tires spinning in the dirt. The sudden movement caught the men off guard, and they stumbled back as I backed up. I didn't wait for them to recover. I spun the car around and sped down the dirt road, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear them shouting behind me, their voices growing fainter as I raced away. I kept my foot on the gas, my eyes focused on the road ahead. The trees blurred past me, the light fading as the sun dipped below the horizon. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get as far away from that house as possible. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached the main road. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in civilization, surrounded by streetlights and other cars. I pulled over to catch my breath, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. I knew I was lucky I had gotten away before those men could do whatever they had planned. I didn't want to think about what might have happened if I'd stayed, if I hadn't reacted quickly enough. It was a reminder that sometimes a wrong turn can lead you into the darkest places, where danger lurks in the shadows. From that day on, I made sure to double-check my directions, to stay on well-traveled roads, and to never take my safety for granted. Because I knew there were places out there where a simple mistake could cost you more than just a few minutes of your time. It could cost you your life. The vanishing patient. Working the night shift at the hospital had its share of eerie moments, but nothing could have prepared me for the night my patient vanished. It started like any other evening. Patients settled in, the hum of medical equipment filling the corridors, and the steady rhythm of nurses and doctors making their rounds. I was in charge of the East Wing, a quiet section reserved for patients recovering from surgery. One of my patients, Mr. Granger, was a middle-aged man who'd been admitted for a routine procedure. He was quiet, polite, and didn't cause any trouble. He mostly kept to himself, reading books and watching TV to pass the time. His recovery was going smoothly, and I expected he'd be discharged within a few days. It was around 2 a.m. when I went to check on him. I entered his room, expecting to find him asleep, but the bed was empty. At first I thought he'd gone to the bathroom or for a walk down the hall, but the door was closed and the lights were off. I checked the bathroom, but it was empty too. I called his name, but there was no response. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. I quickly notified the charge nurse, and we searched the entire wing. We checked every room, every closet, and even the stairwells, but there was no sign of him. Panic set in as we realized he was truly gone. How could a patient disappear from a secure hospital without anyone noticing? The charge nurse called security, and they reviewed the security footage. I watched over their shoulders, my stomach churning with anxiety. The cameras covered the entire East Wing, with feeds from the hallways and exits. We played the footage back from the last few hours, focusing on Mr. Granger's room. It showed me entering the room to check on him, but no one else had gone in or out. How is that possible? I asked, my voice trembling. He has to be here somewhere. The security guard shook his head, his brow furrowed in confusion. Maybe there's a blind spot in the cameras, he suggested. We'll check the other exits. But even after checking every angle, there was no trace of him. It was like he'd simply disappeared. The hospital staff grew uneasy, whispering among themselves about the mysterious vanishing patient. I felt responsible, as if I had somehow let him slip away on my watch. The following day, we checked Mr. Granger's medical records, hoping for some clue about his disappearance. That's when we discovered something unsettling. His records were incomplete, with multiple entries under different names. It was as if he had been admitted to other hospitals before, each time with a different identity. The information was vague, but there were notes about previous escapes from medical facilities, incidents where he had simply vanished without a trace. The realization sent chills down my spine. Who was this man, and why had he created multiple identities? What was he running from, and how had he managed to disappear without anyone noticing? The more I dug into his background, the stranger it became. There were rumors of him being involved in illegal activities, but nothing concrete. It was all hearsay, fragments of a puzzle I couldn't piece together. The hospital administration contacted the police, but they had little to go on. Without clear evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do. The search continued, but Mr. Granger was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had vanished into the night, leaving behind a trail of questions and confusion. The incident haunted me for weeks. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something, that I could have prevented his escape if I had been more attentive. I replayed the events of that night over and over in my mind, searching for any clue, any sign that might have explained his disappearance. The hospital implemented stricter security measures after that, adding more cameras and increasing patrols during the night shift. But the mystery of Mr. Granger's vanishing remained unsolved. It became a cautionary tale among the staff, a reminder that even in a place designed for healing and safety, the unexpected could happen. I eventually left that hospital, seeking a quieter job in a smaller town. The memories of that night still linger, though, a reminder that even in the most secure places, there's always a possibility for the inexplicable. I often wonder where Mr. Granger went, what drove him to create those multiple identities, and if he's still out there somewhere, living a life hidden from the rest of us. The questions remain unanswered, a mystery that I know will never be solved. The dangerous ride. It was supposed to be a simple ride home after a night out with friends. I'd had a few drinks, danced a bit, and enjoyed the evening. It was late, and I was tired, so I ordered a rideshare. The driver showed up in a silver sedan, clean and polished, the type of car you'd expect from a decent rideshare service. He seemed normal enough, a middle-aged guy with a friendly smile and a polite greeting. I got in, feeling that wave of relief that comes when you know you're on your way home. We set off, and I was grateful to relax in the back seat, watching the city lights blur by. It was supposed to be a short drive, maybe 10 minutes at most, but after a few blocks, I noticed the driver wasn't following the route on the app. He took a left turn when he should have gone straight, then made a series of unfamiliar turns that didn't align with the GPS directions. I thought maybe he knew a shortcut, but the streets were getting darker and more desolate, the traffic thinning out. I think we're going the wrong way," I said, leaning forward to show him the app. "We should be on Main Street." The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his smile fading. "Don't worry, I know a better way," he said, his tone oddly curt. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was off, and I couldn't ignore it. I insisted, trying to stay calm but firm. "Can you please follow the route? I'd like to get home." That's when he locked the doors. The sound of the locks clicking shut was like a punch to the gut, a harsh reminder that I was trapped in a moving car with a stranger who had control over my safety. He sped up, ignoring my protests, and the scenery outside grew darker and more industrial. We were heading toward the outskirts of the city, where the streetlights were few and far between, and the buildings were mostly abandoned warehouses and factories. Panic set in, my heart racing as I tried to think of what to do. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The buildings around us seemed to block any connection. I was cut off, isolated in a speeding car with a driver who clearly had other plans. I looked around, trying to find anything I could use as a weapon or a means of escape, but the back seat was bare and the windows were tightly sealed. The driver glanced at me in the mirror, his eyes cold and expressionless, like he was assessing how much trouble I might be. "Hey, where are we going?" I asked, my voice shaking with fear. "This isn't the way to my house." He didn't answer, just kept driving, his foot pressing harder on the gas pedal. The speedometer crept upward, and the scenery outside became a blur. I knew I had to do something, anything to get out of this situation. I started pounding on the window, hoping to attract attention from anyone who might be nearby. but the streets were empty, the only sound the roar of the engine as the driver accelerated. I was running out of options, my mind racing with thoughts of what might happen if I couldn't get out. I tried to think of what my friends would do, what I'd seen in movies or read in survival guides. I remembered hearing that sometimes causing a scene could draw attention, so I started screaming, shouting for help at the top of my lungs. The driver seemed taken aback by my outburst, his grip on the wheel tightening as he glanced around nervously. He hadn't expected me to react like this, and for a moment he seemed uncertain. That was my chance. I lunged forward, grabbing the back of his seat and shaking it, trying to throw him off balance. The car swerved, the tires screeching as he tried to regain control. "Stop the car," I shouted, my voice filled with desperation. "Let me out." He swore under his breath, the car jerking as he struggled to keep it on the road. The chaos of the moment seemed to break his focus, and he slowed down, pulling over to the side of the road. I didn't wait for him to say anything. I unlocked the door and jumped out, tumbling onto the pavement. It hurt, but I didn't care. I was free, away from the car and the driver who'd taken me to this isolated place. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs carrying me as fast as they could. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I found a gas station with lights and people. I called the police, my hands shaking as I explained what happened. They took my statement, and I gave them the driver's information from the rideshare app. I don't know if they ever caught him or what his intentions were, but I knew one thing for sure: I'd never take a rideshare again without being extra cautious. The dangerous ride had shown me that safety isn't guaranteed, even when everything seems normal on the surface. The patient's secret. It wasn't unusual for my patients to be guarded about their past. As a psychiatrist, I knew that some people took longer to open up, especially if they'd experienced trauma or had secrets they wanted to keep hidden. But there was something about Mr. Reynolds that set me on edge from the moment he walked into my office. He was a middle-aged man with a gruff demeanor, his eyes cold and unreadable behind thick glasses. He barely spoke during our sessions, only offering vague answers to my questions. I tried to be patient, giving him space and time to trust me. But every session felt like hitting a brick wall. He'd sit in silence, staring at the floor, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I could sense the tension in him, the way his jaw clenched whenever I asked about his past. It was as if he was carrying a burden too heavy to share. One day I decided to rearrange my office, thinking a change of scenery might help. I moved the chairs, adjusted the lighting, and tidied up the shelves. As I was cleaning, I noticed something under the chair where Mr. Reynolds usually sat. It was a small, leather-bound notebook half hidden beneath the cushion. Curious, I picked it up, expecting it to be a forgotten journal or a set of notes. But as I flipped through the pages, my heart sank. The notebook contained detailed plans for a violent crime. It was filled with diagrams, timelines, and descriptions of various locations. There were sketches of a building layout, marked with entrances and exits, along with notes about security cameras and alarm systems. But what sent chills down my spine was seeing my name and address written in the margins, with a timeline leading to the current day. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My first instinct was to think it was some kind of sick joke or a misunderstanding. But as I read further, the intent was clear. The notebook described a violent attack on my office, with specific details about how and when it would happen. It was like reading a script for a horror movie, only this was real, and I was the target. Panic set in as I realized the gravity of the situation. I quickly locked the notebook in my desk drawer and called the police. I told them about the notebook, explaining who I thought it belonged to and what it contained. They took my call seriously, sending officers to my office to secure the area and begin their investigation. As I waited for the police, I couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal. I'd spent weeks trying to help Mr. Reynolds, offering him a safe space to talk and heal, and all along, he'd been planning something horrific. It was a stark reminder of how little I knew about him and the darkness that lurked behind his silent exterior. The police arrived, and I showed them the notebook, pointing out the plans and my personal information. They took it as evidence and started questioning me about Mr. Reynolds, asking if he had mentioned anything unusual during our sessions. I told them about his reluctance to talk and his guarded demeanor, but I had no other clues to offer. The officers set up surveillance around my office, monitoring the building and the surrounding area. They advised me to stay away for a while, suggesting I work from home or take some time off. The idea of not going to work, not seeing my patients, was unsettling, but I knew I had to prioritize my safety. Over the next few days, I stayed in close contact with the police, checking in for updates and following their instructions. They kept watch on Mr. Reynolds' known addresses, hoping to catch him if he tried to carry out his plans. It was a tense time, filled with anxiety and uncertainty, knowing that someone who'd sat in my office, someone I'd tried to help, might be plotting against me. Eventually, the police located Mr. Reynolds at a motel on the outskirts of town. They arrested him without incident, finding more evidence in his room that linked him to the notebook and the planned crime. The investigation revealed a troubled past with a history of violence and mental instability. It was a sobering reminder of the dangers that could lurk behind even the calmest exteriors. The arrest brought some relief, but it also left me with lingering fears. I took extra precautions with my security, changing my locks and installing an alarm system. I knew I couldn't take any chances, not after what I discovered. The experience changed the way I approached my work, making me more cautious and aware of the risks that came with my profession. I returned to my practice, grateful to be safe, but with a new sense of vigilance. The notebook served as a reminder that even in the world of therapy and healing, darkness could find its way in. It was a stark lesson, one I knew I would never forget. The hostile interview. I was desperate for a job, having spent months searching without success. When I got a call for an interview, I was thrilled. The company was one I hadn't heard of before, but the pay seemed good, and the job description fit my skills. The only odd thing was the location, a remote office building on the outskirts of town. It was tucked away in an industrial area, surrounded by warehouses and factories. I figured it was just a small startup trying to save on rent, so I didn't think much of it. On the day of the interview, I drove out to the address, following my GPS through a maze of narrow streets. The building was old and worn, with cracked windows and graffiti on the walls. There were a few cars parked out front, but the place looked almost deserted. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I'd made a mistake. But I had come this far, and I needed the job. I went inside, and the air was musty, the hallway dimly lit. There was a receptionist desk near the entrance, but no one was there. I called out, but there was no response. I checked my watch, thinking I might be early, but I was right on time. A sense of unease settled over me, but I told myself to stay calm, to give it a chance. After a few minutes, a man appeared from a side door. He was tall and burly, with a thick beard and a scowl on his face. He introduced himself as the interviewer, his voice gruff and unfriendly. He barely looked at me as he led me down the hallway, his footsteps heavy on the worn carpet. We entered a small office, bare except for a desk and a couple of chairs. The walls were stained, and there were no windows. It felt claustrophobic, the kind of place that made you want to leave as soon as possible. The interviewer sat down behind the desk and gestured for me to take a seat. His eyes bore into me, his demeanor tense. The interview started with basic questions about my experience and skills, but his tone was harsh, almost accusatory. He seemed more interested in finding faults than in learning about my qualifications. He asked me about my previous jobs, but his questions quickly turned personal, delving into my family background and relationships. It felt invasive, like he was trying to unsettle me. When he asked about my marital status and whether I had children, I knew he was crossing a line. "I'm not sure that's relevant to the job," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The interviewer leaned back in his chair, his expression turning cold. "I'm the one asking the questions," he snapped. "You better answer them if you want this job." I felt my stomach tighten with anxiety. This wasn't a normal interview, it was hostile, aggressive, and wrong. I decided I had to leave, but when I stood up to go, the interviewer slammed his hand on the desk, his eyes blazing with anger. "Where do you think you're going?" he growled, his voice filled with menace. I backed away, my heart racing. "I'm leaving," I said, trying to sound firm. "This interview is over." But when I reached the door, it was locked. I jiggled the handle, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped in a small, windowless office with a man who was growing increasingly aggressive. I turned to face him, my hands trembling with fear. "Open the door," I demanded, my voice shaking. The interviewer stood up, his fists clenched, his expression violent. "You're not going anywhere until I say so," he said, taking a step toward me. I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed the nearest chair and swung it at the door, the impact sending a shock wave through my arms. The door didn't break, but the noise was loud enough to be heard down the hallway. I swung again, shouting for help, hoping someone would hear me. The interviewer lunged forward, his movements quick and aggressive, but I was ready. I swung the chair at him, catching him off guard. He stumbled back, cursing and clutching his shoulder. I took the opportunity to smash the chair into the door again, finally breaking through the lock. I ran down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get out of that building. I found the main entrance, the door swinging open, as I pushed it with all my strength. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I drove straight to the nearest police station, reporting the incident and giving them the address of the office building. The officers took my statement, assuring me they would investigate. I never found out what happened to the interviewer or what kind of operation was going on in that building, but I knew I was lucky to escape. From that day on, I was more cautious about job interviews, always researching the company and verifying the location before I went. The hostile interview had shown me that even something as ordinary as a job search could turn dangerous, and I wasn't going to take any chances. The experience left me shaken, but it also made me more aware of the risks that could be lurking in unexpected places. The stranger in my house. Coming home after a weekend getaway is usually a comforting feeling, but this time it was different. As soon as I walked through the front door, something felt off. The air had a faint scent of cigarette smoke, and I don't smoke. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe it was just the smell of the neighborhood, or perhaps a neighbor had a party while I was away. But as I moved through my house, I started noticing subtle changes, things that shouldn't have been different. It began with the small stuff. The chair in my living room was slightly out of place, shifted just a few inches from where I usually kept it. The kitchen cabinets had a few doors left ajar, and there was a cup on the counter that I didn't remember leaving there. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness. Maybe I had been in a rush before I left, or maybe it was just a quirk of the house. But then I found my bedroom door slightly open, just a crack, enough to see inside. I was sure I had closed it before leaving, but now it was ajar, like someone had been in there. My heart sank as I walked into the room, my eyes scanning for anything out of place. My bed was made, but the covers looked like they'd been disturbed, not quite as smooth as I left them. And there was a faint smell of perfume in the air, something sweet and flowery, nothing I owned. I started feeling uneasy, a growing sense of dread creeping up my spine. I checked my closet, my dresser drawers, and the bathroom. Everything seemed intact, but the sense of violation was overwhelming. Someone had been in my house, moving things, touching my belongings. It was subtle, but the signs were there. I went back to the living room, trying to calm myself, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. But then I noticed something peeking out from under the couch, a small, round object that caught the light. I reached down and pulled it out, my heart skipping a beat as I realized what it was: an ashtray, half filled with ash and a freshly smoked cigarette. I don't smoke, and I don't allow anyone to smoke in my house. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had been in my home, and they weren't trying to hide it. They left the ashtray as if it were perfectly normal, like they belonged there. The thought made my skin crawl. I knew I had to call the police, but I was afraid to move, afraid to make noise in case the stranger was still in the house. I slowly backed away from the couch, keeping my eyes on the hallway leading to the bedrooms. The house was silent, but the sense of danger was palpable. I made my way to the front door, my heart racing as I reached for my phone. I called the police, my voice trembling as I explained what I'd found. They told me to stay on the line and wait outside, assuring me they would send officers to check the house. I slipped out the front door, my eyes darting around, watching for any sign of movement inside. The police arrived quickly, and they searched the entire house. They didn't find anyone, but they agreed that something was wrong. They took the ashtray as evidence and checked for fingerprints, but the results were inconclusive. Whoever had been in my house had taken precautions, leaving little trace of their presence. The officers advised me to change my locks and install security cameras, which I did the very next day. The thought of someone breaking into my home, moving my things, and leaving behind such a blatant clue filled me with a sense of vulnerability I couldn't shake. I felt like my sanctuary had been violated, and I couldn't trust the safety of my own space. The police continued their investigation, but they never found the intruder. It remained a mystery, an unsettling question mark hanging over my life. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, always double-checking the locks and keeping an eye out for anything unusual. The experience left me with a lingering sense of unease, a constant awareness that someone had been in my home without my knowledge. It changed the way I viewed my house, transforming it from a place of comfort to a place where the shadows held secrets. I knew I'd never feel truly safe there again, not with the memory of the stranger who'd left his mark in the form of a hidden ashtray and a cloud of cigarette smoke. The unsettling discovery. Hiking in remote forests was my escape from the noise and chaos of the city. The silence of the woods, the rustling leaves, the distant calls of birds, it was all a comforting symphony that grounded me. I'd often spend hours exploring trails, losing myself in the beauty of nature. But one day I stumbled upon something that shattered that sense of peace, leaving me with a feeling of dread that I couldn't shake. It was a crisp autumn morning, and I had ventured deep into the forest, following a narrow trail that twisted through the trees. The path was overgrown in places, suggesting that it wasn't used often. I didn't mind. I enjoyed the solitude and the thrill of discovering new places. As I walked, the forest grew thicker, the canopy overhead blocking out most of the sunlight. The air was cool, and the earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves filled my lungs. After about an hour of hiking, I came across a clearing, a small patch of open ground surrounded by tall pines. It was there that I saw the crosses, dozens of them, made of rough-hewn wood, stuck into the ground at various angles. They formed a semicircle around the edge of the clearing, each one about waist high. At first, I thought it was some sort of memorial site, maybe dedicated to those who had passed away in the forest. But as I walked closer, I realized something was very wrong. Each cross had personal belongings attached to it: clothing, jewelry, watches, even eyeglasses. They hung from the crosses, swaying slightly in the breeze, some tied with rope, others nailed directly to the wood. It was an unsettling sight, but what disturbed me most was the condition of the items. They looked recent, like they'd been taken from their owners not long ago. Many of them showed signs of forced removal: torn fabric, broken clasps, and bent frames. It was clear these weren't just mementos, they were evidence of violence. My heart raced as I stood in the clearing, my eyes scanning the surrounding trees. The forest was silent, eerily so, as if the usual sounds of wildlife had vanished. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized I was standing in a place that held dark secrets, a place where people had been harmed, their belongings forcibly taken. I took a few steps back, my instincts screaming at me to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But my curiosity got the better of me, and I approached one of the crosses to examine the items more closely. There was a jacket torn at the seams with what looked like dried blood stains on the collar. A gold watch dangled from a piece of wire, its face cracked and the band twisted. It was like a grotesque display, a grim reminder that this forest held more than just the beauty of nature. I knew I had to report this, but I was miles from civilization, with no cell signal and no one else around. The trail I had taken was rarely used, and it could be hours before I reached a point where I could get help. I felt a surge of fear, a realization that I was alone in a forest where violence had occurred, where the danger might still be lurking in the shadows. I backed away from the crosses, my heart pounding in my chest. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch sent waves of anxiety through me. I felt like I was being watched, like someone or something was observing my every move from the safety of the trees. I turned and ran, my feet pounding the forest floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trail seemed longer on the way back, the twists and turns disorienting as I raced through the forest. I stumbled over roots, my legs aching, but I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead, where my car was parked. I jumped in, locked the doors, and drove as fast as I could back to town. Once I had a signal, I called the authorities, my voice shaking as I explained what I'd found. They took my report seriously, promising to send a team to investigate. I gave them the location of the clearing, detailing the crosses and the personal belongings attached to them. I knew I couldn't leave it unreported, not with what I had seen. The experience left me shaken, a reminder that even the most serene places could hide unimaginable horrors. The forest that had once been my refuge now felt tainted, its beauty overshadowed by the unsettling discovery I had made. I knew I wouldn't be hiking in remote forests for a long time, not after what I had witnessed in that clearing with the wooden crosses and the dark secrets they held. The unexpected reunion. High school reunions are supposed to be fun, a chance to reconnect with old friends and relive memories from the past. When I got the invitation to my 10-year reunion, I was hesitant at first. I hadn't kept in touch with many people from high school, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to revisit those years. But I figured it could be a good opportunity to catch up with a few familiar faces, so I decided to go. The reunion was held at a local hotel, the ballroom decorated with banners and old yearbook photos. There was a buffet, a bar, and a DJ playing songs from our high school days. It was all a bit cheesy, but it brought back memories of football games, prom, and school plays. I wandered through the crowd, saying hello to people I hadn't seen in years, exchanging pleasantries and sharing stories about what we'd been up to. That's when a man approached me, his face lighting up with recognition. He was tall and lean, with a scruffy beard and a slightly disheveled look. He greeted me with a warm smile, as if we were old friends. "Hey. It's been ages," he said, clapping me on the back. "I can't believe you're here. It's so good to see you again." I squinted at him, trying to place his face. He seemed familiar, but I couldn't remember his name, and I was sure we hadn't been close in high school. I gave him a polite smile, hoping he'd mention his name or offer some clue about our past connection. "Yeah, it's great to be here," I replied, playing along. "Sorry, I'm terrible with names. Remind me who you are." He laughed, waving off my confusion. "Oh, come on, it's me, Chris. We used to hang out all the time in senior year. You know, with the gang from Mrs. Parker's class." I didn't remember any Chris from Mrs. Parker's class. In fact, I couldn't recall anyone by that name from high school. But he seemed so sure, so confident that we had been close friends. I didn't want to be rude, so I nodded along, pretending to remember. "Right, Chris." "Yeah, I remember now," I said, hoping to avoid further awkwardness. Chris started talking about high school, reminiscing about parties, teachers, and pranks we supposedly pulled together. I listened, nodding at the right moments, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His stories didn't match any of my memories, and the details were vague at best. It felt like he was fabricating a past that didn't exist, or worse, trying to create a connection where there wasn't one. As the night went on, Chris became more insistent that we had been close friends. He followed me around the ballroom, joining conversations with other people and talking about our good old days. It was starting to feel suffocating, like he was trying to insert himself into my life, rewriting my history to include him. The unsettling part was when he started revealing personal information about me. He mentioned my parents' names, my favorite subjects in high school, and even a childhood pet I'd forgotten about. I hadn't shared any of this with him, and it wasn't the sort of information you'd find in a yearbook. It was as if he'd done extensive research on me, digging into my past to create a narrative that didn't align with my own memories. I excused myself and stepped outside for some air, needing a break from Chris and his unnerving familiarity. The cool night breeze was a relief, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. I checked my phone, hoping to find some information about Chris, but I didn't have any messages or notifications from anyone by that name.